The blue comet should not exist, and yet there it was, hanging beyond the trembling veil of sunlight, burning with a hue that no natural body should possess. In the endless black between worlds, it glowed with the wrong kind of light, a color too sharp, too electric, a blueness brighter than the sun itself. Astronomers first whispered its name in private threads and encrypted calls: 3I Atlas. The third interstellar object ever known to visit the solar system, and the first that made even NASA uneasy. For centuries, comets were omens. To early civilizations, they were tears in the sky, heralds of doom, or messengers from gods. To modern science, they were nothing more than frozen relics, dirty snowballs drifting on ancient orbits. But this one was different. Its light spectrum, its acceleration, its temperature, everything about it defied the physics of a comet. The story began quietly, like a whisper on the edge of human understanding, but soon the whisper turned into a global hum of anxiety. Reports from deep space telescopes began to circulate through the scientific community. The object, catalogued as 3I Atlas, had begun to brighten exponentially as it neared the inner solar system. That in itself wasn't strange. Most comets brighten near the sun, but this one did so with impossible speed. Then came the shock. It wasn't just brightening, it was changing color, a transition from pale gold to electric blue. In the vast machinery of NASA's monitoring networks, alarms triggered silently. Every automated observation was double-checked, every data packet examined. Scientists reprocessed the light curves, recalibrated instruments, ran simulations. Yet the readings remained unshakable. The object was emitting light from material far hotter than the surface of the Sunday. No one wanted to say it aloud, but the data spoke in whispers. Something was powering 3I Atlas from within. Then came the decision that would alter the mood of every major observatory on Earth. Behind closed conference calls, the Earth Defense Group, a rarely mentioned interagency coalition created to coordinate planetary defense, was quietly activated. Officially, it was routine protocol. Unofficially, it was unprecedented. Never before had such a committee been summoned over a comet. The public heard nothing at first. The activation logs were classified. The astrophysicists involved spoke only in carefully worded statements. Yet in the background, something enormous was shifting. Astronomers knew they were staring at a cosmic intruder that did not behave like ice and dust. It behaved like intention. The mystery deepened when amateur telescopes, scattered across observatories from Arizona to Chile, began to confirm the same bizarre readings. Spectral analyses showed that the object's emission curve rose sharply in the ultraviolet range, a trait seen in stars, not comets. At first, skeptics blamed sensor errors, but the pattern held across multiple instruments, across continents, across weeks. Soon, rumors began to echo across forums and podcasts. NASA has found something they can't explain. The words "bluer than the sun" spread like wildfire across social media, catching the attention of science communicators, conspiracy theorists, and government skeptics alike. But behind the spectacle, real scientists were frightened. It wasn't fear of aliens, it was fear of the unknown, because every law of physics told them that this object should not exist in the way it did. It moved through space like a ghost with a heartbeat, pulsing brighter every time it drew closer to the solar furnace. And yet, even as it brightened, it did not evaporate. Comets of that trajectory should lose mass, shed tails of vaporized ice. Atlas remained intact, defiant against the physics that ruled every other known visitor. In October, as it reached its closest point to the sun, it vanished from Earth's view, hidden behind the solar glare. And that was when the speculation reached fever pitch. What if, while hidden behind the sun, it changed course? What if it wasn't just reflecting light, but generating it? In one leaked memo, a single line stood out, stark and unconfirmed. If propulsion is involved, the energy source exceeds stellar temperature. NASA neither confirmed nor denied it, but days later, global partners were notified of a Level 3 interstellar object watch. It was bureaucratic language for prepare for anything. Scientists, writers, philosophers all began to ask the same unspoken question. What if this was not the third interstellar comet, but the first interstellar message? In that question lay the tension of the modern age, the collision between fear and curiosity, between scientific discipline and human wonder. The sky, once mapped and measured, had once again become a mystery. And so, under the calm hum of solar observatories and the endless night of radio telescopes, humanity waited, watched, listened, because somewhere behind the light of the sun, an object that should have been silent was perhaps whispering back. The blue comet that shouldn't exist had come, and with it, the faint tremor of a question older than civilization: are we alone? The night the sky changed was unremarkable at first. In a quiet observatory, perched high in the volcanic deserts of Hawaii, a telescope known as Pan-STARRS was performing its nightly survey of the heavens. It was October dry air, calm winds, and a darkness so complete it felt infinite. The data streamed in, pixel by pixel, star by star, a cosmic inventory as routine as breathing. But among the thousands of familiar dots, one point of light refused to behave. It moved differently, its trajectory bent not by known gravity, but by something stranger, something barely perceptible. Its brightness didn't align with its distance. The algorithms flagged it for review, tagging it as a potential new object. When astronomer James Keen saw the alert, he almost dismissed it. Artifacts, sensor noise, cosmic rays, any number of illusions could cause a false reading. But as the frames stacked, the object persisted. It was real. Within hours, it was catalogued under a provisional name, 3I Atlas. 3I, marking it as only the third identified interstellar object in recorded human history. The Atlas designation came from the telescope system that first sighted it, the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System. The irony was not lost on anyone. The system designed to give Earth its final warning against cosmic threats had just found something from another star. At first, there was excitement, scientific, measured, and contained. Discovering an interstellar object was extraordinary but not unprecedented. In 2017, there had been Oumuamua, a strangely elongated visitor that slingshotted through the solar system with unexplained acceleration. In 2019, the comet Borisov followed a more conventional interstellar traveler of ice and gas. 3I Atlas was expected to be another such wanderer, a scientific curiosity, not a cause for alarm. But even in the early days, it felt different. Its light curve was unstable. It brightened too quickly, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the hue, at first subtle, began shifting toward a pale cerulean tone. Data analysts in Arizona confirmed the change. Then observatories in Chile, then Japan. By the second week, the confirmation was undeniable. The object was emitting light bluer than the Sunday. For the astronomers who spent lifetimes staring into cold data, color meant everything. It was temperature, composition, motion, age. A blue spectrum implied heat, enormous heat, far beyond the reflective capabilities of frozen gas. Something was energizing it. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory began to model its trajectory. Based on its speed over 110,000 miles per hour, it had entered the solar system from the direction of the constellation Auriga. Its origin was unknown. Its path, however, intersected perilously close to the inner planets. When the first report reached the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies, No one panicked, but as more readings came in brightness curves, spectral analysis, radar echoes, the unease began to grow. It was as though this object were alive to sunlight, feeding on it, responding to its proximity. Comets sublimate when they near the Sunday Atlas did not sublimate, it ignited. The data logs show a single timestamp, October 3rd, 2025, 2:11 UTC. The Night 3I Atlas officially became an anomaly. A quiet message was sent from NASA to the International Asteroid Warning Network, the IAWN, a collaborative body linking space agencies and research centers worldwide. The message was short. Object exhibits non-thermal light signature inconsistent with known cometary physics. Further observation required. Possible artificial reflectivity under investigation. Those words, possible artificial reflectivity, would ripple through the scientific world like a shock wave. Artificial meant deliberate, artificial meant constructed. In private circles, scientists debated endlessly. Could it be a rare mineral composition? Could magnetic interaction with the solar wind explain the emission? Or was there, impossibly, something inside the object, something generating its own energy? No consensus emerged. What did emerge, however, was fear. Weeks later, as the story reached the media, NASA released a brief statement. 3I Atlas is under continued observation. Preliminary findings suggest an unusual but natural interstellar object. But by then, the rumor machine had already taken hold. Amateur astronomers across the world trained their instruments on the coordinates, uploading shaky images, graphs, and whispered theories. It's an engine, one said. It's a ship, said another. It's the same as Oumuamua, but it's staying longer. In the same period, an internal meeting was convened at NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office. Normally, such meetings dealt with trajectory corrections, impact probabilities, asteroid deflection techniques. This one had a different tone, not fear of collision but of meaning. If 3I Atlas was something more than a rock, what did that imply about our place in the cosmic hierarchy? The minutes of that meeting were never released. What is known is that following it, NASA's Earth Defense Group, a task force meant for planetary response coordination, was quietly placed on alert status. No public announcement, no press release, just a line in the system, operational readiness level raised. Astronomers who had worked with the Atlas telescope years before now watched the skies in uneasy silence. Data continued to pour in. The object was accelerating slightly, in a pattern eerily reminiscent of Oumuamua's own unexplained boost. The odds of two interstellar objects behaving this way by coincidence were infinitesimal. And yet, the object remained mute. No radio emissions, no signatures of communication, only its impossible blueness, shimmering like a fragment of a dying star. In one corner of the world, a small team at Harvard began to run simulations of how a light sail might behave near the Sunday. In another, engineers at ESA compared its spectral reflections to known alloys. The match was inconclusive but unsettlingly close. Somewhere in those calculations, a quiet realization began to take root. If 3I Atlas wasn't natural, then it wasn't ours. And if it wasn't ours, then someone, somewhere, had sent it. The night the sky changed had passed, unnoticed by most. But for the few who had seen the data, the universe itself no longer felt like an empty stage. It felt observed. The first discovery had been made, and in its wake, a new kind of fear had been born, not of impact, but of contact. The name hung in the air like a ghost, Oumuamua. For the scientists who remembered 2017, 3I Atlas felt like a haunting déjà vu, another visitor from the deep void, another traveler whose behavior mocked the neat equations of celestial mechanics. And, For those who had lived through the debates of that earlier encounter, the strange blueness of Atlas carried a faint echo of something unfinished, an unanswered question that refused to die. Oumuamua had been humanity's first confirmed interstellar object. Discovered by the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii, it arrived unannounced, slicing through our solar system at 196,000 miles per hour. It was cigar-shaped, tumbling erratically, and accelerating away from the sun for reasons no one could explain. It reflected sunlight in a way that implied it was flat, perhaps even metallic. And when Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb proposed it might be a piece of alien technology, the world laughed, then argued, then fell uncomfortably silent. But as time passed, the data grew colder, the object vanished into the dark, and the debate was left unresolved. Science moved on. The mystery was filed under unexplained natural phenomenon, a polite way of saying we don't know. Now, 8 years later, the pattern had returned but amplified. 3I Atlas was not just repeating the enigma, it was deepening it. Where Oumuamua had been mysterious, Atlas was defiant. It didn't hide in faint reflection, it blazed brighter than the Sunday. And its color, its temperature, its stubborn refusal to behave like any known comet made the déjà vu unbearable. The astronomers who had once defended the natural theory radiation pressure, volatile gases, strange shapes, now found themselves hesitating, because the explanations that barely held for Oumuamua simply broke apart under Atlas. There was no outgassing, no visible tail, no signs of disintegration, just an object that seemed to react to sunlight, not be destroyed by it. As it moved toward perihelion, the point nearest the sun, its brightness spiked exponentially. Data from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, SOHO, showed a blue-white radiance blooming around it, a halo of energy expanding more than 300,000 kilometers into space. The math was impossible. That luminosity required temperatures exceeding 6,000 Kelvin, surpassing the sun's photosphere. And yet the object was small, barely a kilometer across. How could something so small radiate like a star? When the first comparisons to Oumuamua began to circulate, NASA's internal channels tightened. The Earth Defense Group was officially briefed, and external communication was locked under new classification tags. The phrase used was controlled observation period. Avi Loeb, however, refused to remain quiet. In a press interview, his voice calm and deliberate, he said, "If a civilization had the technology to travel between stars, they wouldn't send a ship, they'd send a messenger. Small, efficient, self-propelled. That's what Oumuamua could have been, and perhaps 3I Atlas is another." The scientific establishment pushed back, as always, yet his words carried the weight of memory. Oumuamua had taught humanity a lesson about arrogance, the arrogance of thinking we already knew what space could contain. Now, Atlas seemed to arrive as its mirror, its sequel, its escalation. In both cases, the pattern was uncanny. Detection, confusion, debate, disappearance. But this time, there was one major difference. NASA wasn't treating Atlas as a mere curiosity, it was treating it as a potential threat. Not because it was hostile, but because it was unpredictable. For every kilometer it traveled, Atlas left behind questions. Why was it accelerating at such irregular intervals? Why was its light fluctuating with mathematical precision, as though responding to solar activity? And above all, why was it blue? Physicists in Switzerland began to model possible mechanisms: plasma interactions, electromagnetic reflection, exotic isotopes. None of them fit. The spectral signature suggested emission, not reflection, meaning whatever light it gave off wasn't sunlight bouncing back, it was its own. By mid-October, public awareness began to grow. A handful of journalists connected the dots between Atlas and the earlier interstellar anomalies. "Is NASA facing another Oumuamua moment?" read one headline. Another simply said, "The return of the impossible visitor." But behind the headlines, the truth was far stranger. Through the Rubin Observatory in Chile, a faint pattern was detected, an oscillation in brightness repeating at regular intervals. Every 10.2 hours, Atlas pulsed slightly. It was subtle, almost buried in noise, but consistent. To some, it looked like rotation. To others, it looked like something else entirely: modulation. Was it spinning or was it signaling? No one could say. And yet, the fact that such a question was even asked marked a profound shift. The boundary between astronomy and philosophy had begun to blur. NASA's Deep Space Network quietly redirected one of its radio dishes to listen near Atlas's trajectory. The data was classified. No signals were ever publicly confirmed, but the silence around the mission spoke louder than words. For the first time, humanity seemed to be preparing not to discover something, but to encounter it. It was in this climate of cautious dread that the phrase Earth Defense Group activation leaked to the public. It was a bureaucratic phrase, cold and impersonal, but its implications were enormous. Officially, the group existed to coordinate planetary defense strategies, impact avoidance, asteroid mitigation, emergency response. Unofficially, it was the protocol for first contact. The irony was almost cosmic. The species that had spent centuries fearing extinction from rocks falling from the sky now feared something subtler, an intelligence arriving disguised as one. In research papers, Atlas became an anomaly. In conversations, a riddle. In the minds of those who gazed at the stars, a symbol. The name Oumuamua meant scout or messenger in Hawaiian. If Atlas followed that lineage, it begged a simple, devastating question. If this is the messenger, what sent it? By the end of October, the object passed behind the sun, hidden from Earth's view. The telescopes fell silent. The sensors went dark. For months, there would be no direct observation, only anticipation. But even in that silence, humanity's imagination filled the void. For every mind that believed 3I Atlas was just an anomaly, there was another that wondered perhaps the cosmos was finally speaking back. And maybe, this time, we would have no choice but to listen. There are words in NASA's internal lexicon that the public is never meant to hear. One of them is activation, a sterile term that hides the tremor of urgency beneath layers of bureaucratic calm. When news broke inside the agency that the Earth Defense Group had been activated, the corridors of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory grew uncharacteristically quiet. In Pasadena, under the desert sun, the hum of supercomputers mixed with the low murmur of voices speaking in careful tones. No one wanted to be the first to say it aloud, that the protocols being dusted off were never meant for something like this. They were designed for impact threats, asteroid trajectories, collision probabilities, gravitational corrections. But 3I Atlas wasn't on a collision course. It wasn't even behaving like an asteroid. It was doing something far more unnerving. It was thinking, or at least that's what it looked like. The activation order was not dramatic. No alarms, no cinematic countdown, just a signature transmitted to multiple agencies: NASA, ESA, JAXA, and the US Space Force. The message was simple and coded: 3I Atlas under high-priority surveillance, full readiness authorization. At the same time, the International Asteroid Warning Network, IAWN, began coordinating data exchange between observatories in Chile, Hawaii, and the Canary Islands. The command was clear: track Atlas with every available instrument, analyze its emissions, record its trajectory, look for patterns. Patterns meant intelligence. In the following hours, every major observatory on Earth aligned its gaze toward the coordinates. Yet even as telescopes captured its brightness, there was no comfort in the data. The object's light curves spiked erratically, not random, not chaotic, but structured, almost rhythmic. The pulses weren't evenly spaced, but neither were they noise. Somewhere in between, like breathing. And that was what terrified them. In Houston, at the Johnson Space Center, an emergency session was convened. Scientists, engineers, defense advisors, and communication specialists crowded around a holographic projection of Atlas's trajectory. The glowing line curved elegantly around the Sun, its orbital path grazing the edges of Mercury's aphelion. At first glance, it was natural, a gravitationally bound arc. But deeper models told another story. Tiny deviations, millimeter shifts per second, were accumulating, too consistent to be random. Those deviations were corrections. Self-guided, one physicist murmured. Like an active spacecraft, another replied, before silence reclaimed the room. NASA's official stance remained conservative. Their public press release described the activation of the Earth Defense Group as a precautionary coordination step to ensure ongoing observation of near-solar anomalies. But privately, the tone was different. This wasn't a drill. This was the first unknown technological signal moving through our solar neighborhood, and it wasn't talking to us. Meanwhile, in Geneva, representatives from the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, UNOOSA, received the briefing through encrypted lines. The word artifact appeared in several documents, object of potential non-natural origin in others, and always, at the bottom of each page, the same classification tag, Planetary Response Protocol, Level 3. Level 3 was unprecedented. It meant something whose behavior could not be explained by current astrophysical models, and which, if misunderstood, could cause global panic. To prevent that, NASA decided to go dark. Images taken from their solar observation satellites were withheld, citing the US government shutdown as an excuse. The public, they said, would have to wait. But the world didn't wait. Independent astronomers began to demand transparency. Forums filled with speculation. If Atlas was natural, why the secrecy? Why the mobilization? Why the sudden cooperation between NASA, Space Force, and the Department of Defense? Inside the agency, the reasoning was clear. The data coming from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory SOHO had already shown spectral irregularities. Atlas wasn't just reflecting sunlight, it was emitting frequencies consistent with plasma engines. Theoretical propulsion, yes, but propulsion nonetheless. One scientist dared to propose an internal memo titled Thrust Signature Analysis, Atlas 3 I-25. The conclusion was buried in jargon, but one line stood out in quiet dread. Emission profile consistent with directed plasma exhaust exceeding 6,000 kelvins. Apparent control over vector alignment. If true, that meant the object had control over its motion, the defining characteristic of an engineered craft. Still, the Earth Defense Group's role was not to declare what Atlas was, it was to ensure what it wouldn't do, impact Earth, or worse, interfere with it. Satellites were redirected. Deep space radar arrays pinged the region behind the Sunday. The Very Large Array in New Mexico swept for faint electromagnetic anomalies. None found definitive evidence of communication. But even silence in the cosmic void can be terrifying. Because silence can mean control. By late October, the order was given to extend the monitoring network beyond Earth. The Lunar Gateway's experimental sensors were tasked to listen for fluctuations in the solar wind around Atlas's projected path. Aboard the ISS, instruments were recalibrated for ultraviolet monitoring. Even Mars orbiters, under the guise of solar research, began recording background flux. And then something subtle but unmistakable happened. Atlas's trajectory shifted again, a fraction of a degree, but measurable. The correction was made precisely when it was closest to the Sun, the point of maximum gravitational influence. To anyone who understood orbital mechanics, it was the perfect moment for a maneuver. That realization sent a chill through the defense group's command room. If Atlas were natural, it would have been at its most vulnerable, bombarded by radiation and heat. If it were artificial, however, if it used the Sun's gravity for slingshot propulsion, then this was no coincidence. It was navigation. NASA's director of planetary defense reportedly whispered, "It's doing what we do." In a single line, the philosophical became existential. For decades, humanity had looked at the stars as an empty theater, a place to project our imagination, not to meet it. But here, perhaps, was something playing the same game, using gravity, using light, using motion with intention. After the activation, a quiet ripple spread through other agencies. The European Space Agency raised its alert level. Japan's JAXA offered to redirect their Hayabusa relay network for real-time telemetry. The US Air Force, under the guise of Space Weather Response, opened contingency channels for data sharing. All of it was wrapped in silence. The news media, unaware of the details, began to sense tension. Rumors surfaced about space defense meetings and classified solar object investigations. NASA denied the claims, of course, but the words Earth Defense Group escaped anyway, and the internet did the rest. To the public, it sounded apocalyptic. To the scientists, it was simply prudent. To history, it may have been the moment humanity quietly admitted we are no longer the only ones preparing for contact. And somewhere, beyond the sun's blinding glare, 3I Atlas continued its silent approach, blue, brilliant, and unyielding. A question made of light, gliding toward us across the sea of stars. Light is the oldest messenger in the universe. It carries the language of creation, the whisper of distant suns, the residue of birth and death among the stars. And for as long as humanity has been able to read its code, color has meant truth. Red means cool, slow, and old. Blue means heat, energy, and youth. No comet in history has ever glowed bluer than the Sunday until now. The first spectrum of 3I Atlas arrived from the Soho Observatory's LASCO instrument, a coronagraph designed to mask the sun's glare and reveal the space around it. When scientists decomposed the incoming light, the result made no sense. The curve rose sharply in the ultraviolet, not reflective sunlight, not scattered dust, emission. Atlas was glowing with its own energy. Its hue was not simply an artifact of viewing angle or camera calibration. It was intrinsic, like a furnace too hot for ice, too perfect for chaos. At 5,800 Kelvin, the surface of the sun glows white-yellow. Atlas, by comparison, measured at an equivalent color temperature exceeding 6,200. A comet colder than frost, shining hotter than a star. Theories collapsed one by one. Some said it was sublimation ice vaporizing off its surface, but the rate was wrong. Even the most volatile compounds would have burned off long before this brightness. Others suggested reflective crystals, silicate fragments catching sunlight, but no known mineral could produce such consistent ultraviolet bias. So they looked deeper. Data from the twin stereo spacecraft confirmed it. The blueness wasn't flickering randomly. It deepened with proximity to the Sunday, like something charging, absorbing energy, transforming light into motion. And then came the numbers. Photometric readings indicated that the brightness was scaling inversely, with distance squared, but with an additional term, a rise that exceeded solar input by 40%. Something inside was feeding on the sun, not just reflecting it. That was when an unsettling phrase began to circulate inside the analysis reports. Thrust temperature. One scientist, in a moment of quiet frustration, wrote in his notes, "It looks like exhaust." At first, it was meant metaphorically, but as more data came in, the metaphor began to sound literal. Across the ocean, at Harvard's Black Hole Initiative, Avi Loeb reviewed the same figures. The numbers echoed the same impossible logic that had haunted him since Oumuamua, the logic of technology masquerading as nature. In a podcast interview, he spoke slowly, his words careful but charged. If you saw a shining object crossing your backyard, accelerating without visible propulsion, would you assume it's a rock or a vehicle? He paused, then added, "The same question applies here." The statement circulated widely, and for a brief moment, the public imagination reignited. The idea of alien technology, dormant since the first interstellar visitor, returned with a vengeance. But to those inside NASA, it was not wonder, it was disquiet. Because if Atlas was emitting energy hotter than the sun, then what could power it? Nuclear fusion was unlikely. Its size was too small. Chemical reaction? Impossible. There was no sign of expulsion. The only mechanism left belonged to the realm of theory, direct energy propulsion, a device converting light into acceleration, not by combustion, but by the manipulation of electromagnetic fields. For decades, humanity had dreamed of such propulsion. Laser sails, solar plasma drives, photonic engines. We had built prototypes, but none had left the cradle of our orbit. Now, an object from the deep void seemed to demonstrate it effortlessly. The phrase alien technology was never used in official documents. The preferred term was non-natural emission anomaly, but to the engineers staring at the data, the meaning was obvious. Atlas's temperature profile wasn't random, it correlated with its vector toward the Sunday. When solar activity spiked, when flares erupted and radiation peaked, the object's brightness intensified, as if responding, as if alive. When plotted over time, its color curve formed a near-perfect sinusoid, rising, falling, pulsing. The period matched its rotational pattern. Every 10 hours, the object's spectrum shifted slightly, like a machine turning in rhythm. Then came the most disturbing discovery. The blueness wasn't uniform. It radiated strongest from one hemisphere, fading toward the other, meaning the light wasn't spherical, it was directional. On Earth, that would be called a thruster burn. Still, science resisted panic. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps nature was mimicking design, but the poetic symmetry was hard to ignore. The object's blueness, its pulse, its heat all evoked something mechanical, deliberate, beautiful in its defiance. At the European Space Operations Center in Darmstadt, a young analyst named Maria Rossi studied the emission graphs for days. In her report, she added a single handwritten note in the margin, one that circulated quietly among her peers. If this is natural, then nature just built its first engine. That phrase, equal parts awe and fear, captured the essence of the moment. Humanity was staring at a cosmic mirror and seeing the reflection of intelligence, either our own or another's, looking back. In the weeks that followed, every major astrophysical journal debated the blueness of Atlas. Some called it a data illusion, others an unrecognized physical process. But beneath the debate lay something deeper, a subtle, collective awareness that perhaps we were standing on the edge of a revelation too large for language. For in that radiant blue light, hotter than a star, flickered the oldest paradox in science, the one that asks whether observation creates reality or merely reveals it. And as NASA's instruments continued to record the impossible glow, one question burned through every sleepless mind. watching the data scroll across their screens. If 3i Atlas was shining with its own fire, then who lit it? Then came the silence. As October bled into November, 3 Atlas slipped behind the sun, concealed by the furnace of daylight where no Earth-based telescope could follow. It was called solar conjunction, a simple alignment of geometry, but to astronomers it felt like blindness. The object was gone, hidden in the glare of the one light too bright for even our greatest eyes. It was the perfect moment for a mystery to deepen. In the days before its disappearance, the last images from the Stereo A spacecraft showed something strange, a brief surge of luminosity like a pulse, followed by rapid dimming. The emission spectrum flared in the ultraviolet, spiking beyond calibration limits, then vanished. It wasn't the sun's reflection, it was as though Atlas had flashed. A last signal, before descending into invisibility. NASA's solar observers described it clinically, quote, transient photometric surge correlated with perihelion passage, quote, but within the Earth Defense Group, the description was less restrained. Some called it a maneuver, others called it a metamorphosis. For months, the scientific world could only wait. During solar conjunction, the sun stood between Earth and Atlas, its electromagnetic noise drowning out any potential radio contact, its brilliance obscuring visual confirmation. We couldn't see, couldn't listen, couldn't measure. The object was beyond reach, orbiting the hidden side of our own star. And that, some feared, was exactly the point. Dr. Avi Loeb's voice surfaced again in interviews, each statement measured, almost prophetic. If this were an engineered object, the sun would be the ideal cover for a course correction. The gravitational slingshot, combined with solar radiation pressure, could allow a deliberate change in trajectory unseen by our instruments. It was a haunting suggestion. If 3i Atlas were technological, then its disappearance behind the sun was no accident, it was strategy. The Stereo and SOHO satellites kept their watch. Designed to orbit ahead and behind Earth, they had the rare vantage to observe what the planet could not. Through their coronagraphs, faint traces of blue persisted, a whisper of light through the solar haze. But it wasn't steady. It flickered with purpose, like something alive within the fire. In laboratories from Maryland to Munich, analysts replayed the data over and over. The energy signature fluctuated not randomly, but rhythmically, as though responding to solar bursts. When the sun flared, Atlas brightened. When it calmed, Atlas dimmed. The correlation was too precise, too neat. By then, the narrative had escaped scientific control. Leaked reports, some authentic, some fabricated, spread through the internet, claiming NASA was tracking an object, maneuvering independently. Others said NASA had lost contact with it entirely. The truth was somewhere in between, no contact, but not absence. Meanwhile, new satellite arrays were brought online. The GOES-19 weather satellite, equipped with a compact coronagraph, began recording faint ultraviolet plumes in the sun's outer corona, each one pointing outward from the direction of 3i Atlas. When compiled, the plumes resembled spirals, as though the object was ejecting something, particles, plasma, perhaps even energy bursts. To most physicists, the data suggested cometary outgassing under extreme solar heating. But those who studied propulsion saw something else: vector control. The blue light was strongest when aligned with the object's forward motion, fading as it curved behind. That directional bias hinted at intent, not randomness. The possibility was maddening. A machine hiding behind the sun, using its energy as a shield, repositioning itself while Earth was blind. No telescope on the ground could confirm anything until December. The entire world of astronomy stood in limbo, an entire civilization staring into its own reflection, waiting for the light to shift. And in that waiting, unease grew. For the public, the absence of information was fertile ground for fear. Talk shows spoke of NASA's blackout. Headlines whispered defense activation, government silence, potential encounter. Yet beneath the noise, the real scientists, the quiet watchers, knew the deeper truth. They were witnessing something unique in the history of observation, a celestial vanishing act written in the language of physics. Even among the skeptics, doubts began to form. Nature rarely choreographs such precision. A comet doesn't dim in rhythm with solar flares. A rock doesn't align its emission axis with its trajectory. And yet, Tracy Atlas did both. As November wore on, a single question began to echo through research centers. When it emerges, will it be the same? Every orbit changes an object, heat fractures, dust trails, mass loss. But if Atlas were technological, then its return could reveal design, structure, symmetry. At NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, deep within the Solar Dynamics Lab, an image analyst named Terence Patel put it in simple terms during a midnight briefing. If it comes out brighter, it's charging. If it comes out dimmer, it's dying. No one responded. The only sound was the hum of servers processing solar telemetry. Outside, the sun flared again, painting auroras across Earth's poles. But far beyond those curtains of light, somewhere in the hidden daylight beyond our sight, a smaller light moved deliberately, a question wrapped in fire. Days passed, then weeks. And though no one could yet see it, every scientist knew the moment it reappeared would be definitive. Either 3I Atlas would emerge like a comet reborn, or like something we were never meant to witness. In the shadow of the sun, the universe held its breath. When the signal of Atlas fell silent behind the sun, one voice refused to fade with it. Avi Loeb, the theoretical astrophysicist who had already endured ridicule for daring to call another interstellar object, Oumuamua, what others feared to name, a messenger. For years, he had stood at the uneasy crossroads of physics and philosophy, arguing that the universe might already have spoken, and that science, in its caution, simply refused to listen. Now, with 3I Atlas exhibiting behavior so improbable, so calculated, Loeb's ideas no longer sounded like heresy. They sounded like prophecy. In a dim lecture hall at Harvard's Department of Astronomy, Loeb's calm voice broke through the silence of students and reporters alike. If you want to understand what something is, you must first accept that it may not be what you expect. He walked slowly before the projected image of 3I Atlas, a false color composite, glowing electric blue. When a comet brightens, he continued, it releases gas. When Atlas brightens, it releases questions. For a moment, no one laughed. The sentence lingered like a confession. His argument was not that Atlas was an alien probe, but that it could be, and that refusing to entertain the possibility was unscientific. Science, he reminded them, is not belief, it is curiosity disciplined by evidence. Yet evidence requires interpretation, and interpretation demands imagination. Behind closed doors, even his critics began to read his white papers again. In one particularly bold memo sent to the International Astronomical Union, Loeb warned that humanity lacked an organized plan for technological interstellar encounters. He proposed a framework, a way to respond should an extraterrestrial artifact enter our solar system. It was, in essence, a cosmic emergency manual. The media dubbed it the Loeb Protocol. Among its recommendations was the creation of early warning probes stationed in the outer solar system, designed to intercept unidentified technological objects. Ironically, within weeks, NASA's Earth Defense Group would begin drafting similar plans, though their motives were less philosophical and more pragmatic. Loeb's insistence carried a simple logic. If Atlas was a vehicle, then it might act while unseen. And that meant humanity's blindness during solar conjunction wasn't coincidence, it was vulnerability. "If I were to design a probe," he mused during an interview, "I'd maneuver near the Sunday. It's the perfect gravitational lens and the perfect hiding place." That phrase, "the perfect hiding place," spread quickly. It captured the dread underlying every observatory report that maybe Atlas wasn't just drifting, maybe it was waiting. In the aftermath of his comments, academic circles split sharply. Some accused him of sensationalism, others defended his courage. But for the first time, public attention shifted from ridicule to respect. The world was starting to realize that disbelief, too, could be a kind of blindness. Meanwhile, NASA maintained silence. The withheld solar images, the classified communications, the absence of data, all of it only fueled suspicion. The timing couldn't have been worse. Political tensions were high, budgets tight, the world weary of conspiracies. And yet, for the first time in decades, the common person and the astrophysicist shared a single, unnerving question. What if he's right? In a televised interview, Loeb was asked what frightened him most about 3I Atlas. His response was not fear, but melancholy. "We've waited all our history for proof that we're not alone, but the tragedy is that when it arrives, we may be too proud to recognize it." It was a sentiment that resonated far beyond academia. Artists began painting the blue comet as a divine eye. Poets described it as the second dawn, filmmakers as an omen. Atlas had become a mirror, reflecting not aliens, but humanity's longing for significance in an indifferent cosmos. And yet, beneath that poetry, the science marched forward. Data from Stereo B suggested a faint asymmetry in Atlas's brightness curve, a dip occurring at precise intervals. The team at Goddard labeled it pattern delta. Loeb, when shown the graph, simply smiled and said, "That's rotation, maybe also intention." He was not claiming communication, he was claiming intelligence, an ability to adjust, to respond, to exist in dialogue with the forces around it. Behind him, the image of the blue object hung suspended against the blackness of space, a point of light, no larger than a pixel, yet powerful enough to tilt the philosophy of an entire planet. In the months to come, Loeb's voice would inspire new research initiatives, projects that would merge astronomy with astrobiology, propulsion physics, and even information theory. For perhaps the first time, scientists were daring to ask, how would we know if the universe had already sent us a message, but in a form we were unequipped to interpret? The irony, of course, was that 3I Atlas was still silent. No radio emissions, no signatures of data streams, no detectable modulation beyond light, yet its silence was almost louder than speech. In every flicker of its blue glow, humanity sensed not absence, but restraint, the silence of something that was choosing not to speak. Late one evening, Loeb was asked a final question by a journalist standing outside his office. "Do you really think it's alien?" He looked up at the night sky, where only a few faint stars pierced the Boston haze, and answered, "I think it's possible that it's not ours, and that possibility alone should be enough to humble us." Humility, the rarest form of intelligence, was perhaps what the mystery of Atlas demanded most. For in that single blue speck behind the sun, human civilization was being tested not in weaponry or wealth, but in wonder. By late November, the catalogue of anomalies had grown so vast that it required its own classification index. The scientists had started calling it the Atlas 9, 9 distinct behaviors that defied the laws of cometary physics. Each was an offense against expectation, and together they painted a portrait of something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The first was its brightness surge, unmatched by any comet on record. The second, its color inversion, shifting from solar gold to stellar blue. The third, directional emission, a glow stronger on one side, suggesting motion or thrust. The fourth, mass stability, no signs of fragmentation despite proximity to the Sunday. The fifth, rotational modulation, a rhythmic pulse, constant through observation. The sixth, non-linear acceleration, subtle but measurable. The seventh, thermal excess temperatures that mocked thermodynamics. The eighth, spectral silence, a complete absence of the chemical fingerprints that define icy bodies. And finally, the ninth, the strangest of all perihelion blueness, the object's peak luminosity not fading but intensifying as it neared the star that should have destroyed it. These were the 9 blasphemies of 3I Atlas, and together they forced the scientific world into quiet rebellion. At NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, physicist Mei-Ling Zhao stared at the compiled charts. "It's as if it's rewriting what a comet can be," she whispered. Her supervisor, an older man who had spent 3 decades modeling asteroids, said nothing. He simply closed the graph. There was nothing left to model. Each anomaly invited a new theory, and each theory fell apart under scrutiny. Gas jets? None detected. Ice composition? Wrong spectrum. Dust scattering? Too uniform. Even the energy output made no sense. The blue light radiating from Atlas corresponded to heat levels impossible for matter that small to sustain without disintegration. And yet, night after night, the emissions held steady. The term artifact hypothesis began appearing in internal memos. Not alien, not intelligent, simply artifactual. Something built, not born. And if it was built, then someone, somewhere, had built it. The tone in research papers shifted. Words once reserved for science fiction, design, structure, mechanism, slipped quietly into peer-reviewed drafts. Others, fearing professional exile, couched their curiosity in code. Non-gravitational factors, reflective irregularities, exogenic behaviors. But no euphemism could disguise the truth. The data was telling a story, and that story sounded engineered. When the European Space Agency published their joint statement, it was almost poetic in its restraint. 3I. Atlas exhibits a series of unresolved phenomena not currently explainable by known models of cometary dynamics. Further observation required post-solar conjunction. Behind that cold phrasing lay a tremor of awe. For all our telescopes, sensors and equations, humanity was once again standing before something it could only describe as impossible. In a televised interview, one astronomer tried to simplify it for the public. Imagine watching a snowflake fly through a volcano and come out brighter. That, he said, was the miracle of Atlas. And so, scientists waited for December 19th, 2025, the date when the comet would emerge from behind the Sun and make its closest approach to Earth. Every major telescope, from Hubble to James Webb, was scheduled for observation. The world's eyes, both optical and metaphorical, were fixed on the dark side of the Sunday. But waiting breeds reflection. In think tanks and conferences, quiet debates grew louder. What if the object wasn't singular? What if others had come before it, hidden among the billions of icy wanderers we call comets? What if Oumuamua and Atlas were not coincidences, but chapters in a longer story? Human history was built on patterns, on connecting dots across the void. And here, in the heart of the solar system, 2 dots had appeared within a single human lifetime, each challenging the same assumptions. The odds of that being random were vanishingly small. To Loeb, to Zhao, to Rossi, and dozens of others, the pattern felt like intent, a design, maybe even a reconnaissance. If you send one probe to survey a civilization, Loeb remarked, it might be ignored. If you send two, separated by time, it becomes a pattern. In that idea lay an unspoken fear that the universe was not empty, but structured, and that humanity was being studied from afar. Still, the rational minds held firm. Correlation, they argued, was not causation. Until the object reappeared, all talk of intention was speculation. And yet, late at night, in observatories lit only by the soft glow of monitors, scientists found themselves staring at the blue dot on their screens as if it were staring back. When the brightness logs updated one last time before conjunction blackout, the data carried a poetic symmetry. Atlas's light curve peaked at precisely the same amplitude as its initial detection months before, perfectly mirrored. Symmetry, like intelligence, rarely occurs by chance. And so, with that perfect balance recorded, the watchers of Earth faced a paradox. Every new piece of evidence made 3I Atlas look less like a rock and more like a message. But the more they learned, the less they understood what the message meant. 9 anomalies, 9 questions, 9 reflections of our ignorance. The next time Atlas appeared, they knew the answer would come in light. Until then, the cosmos held its riddle, sealed behind the glare of the sun, the oldest veil in the universe, hiding perhaps not a comet, but a creation. They called them the eyes in the void. Not poets this time, but engineers, the quiet, methodical kind who build machines to stare unblinking into the infinite. SOHO, Stereo, and GOES-19, 3 satellites orbiting far from Earth, each gazing toward the sun, each recording a story written in light. And for the weeks while humanity itself was blind, it was these machines that kept vigil. In their mirrored sensors, 3I Atlas became a whisper of brilliance threading through the storm of solar radiation. The Stereo spacecraft, one moving ahead of Earth's orbit, one behind, captured the faint silhouette as it drifted through the corona. To human eyes, the images looked like noise, static, flares, and the roaring brightness of our star. But within that chaos, software found rhythm. Every few hours, the instruments registered a small, deliberate fluctuation, a pulse, not random, not chaotic, but mechanical. The glow expanded, contracted, expanded again, in a heartbeat older than any machine built on Earth. Scientists at the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, SOHO, studied the data with reverence. The LASCO coronagraph, designed to watch solar eruptions, had become an accidental witness to something stranger. Through its lens, Atlas appeared wrapped in a faint, circular haze almost 300,000 kilometers wide. The data showed a plume symmetrical, consistent, unchanging. At first they called it coma extension, the gaseous shroud of a melting comet, but the math betrayed the name. The temperature of the plume exceeded expectations by thousands of degrees. It wasn't vapor, it wasn't dust, it was energy. Then came the discovery that changed the tone from curiosity to unease. The emission vectors lines representing the direction of light weren't radial. They didn't scatter outward as they should. They converged, slightly offset from the sun's gravity, as if guided, as if steering. In Houston, a low-voice meeting convened. NASA analysts projected 3D simulations of the emission. The pattern repeated every 10.2 hours, the same interval as Atlas's brightness pulse. The team realized it wasn't rotation alone, it was coordination. Energy release synchronized with orientation, a self-stabilizing mechanism. On the whiteboard, someone wrote 2 words: attitude control. No one spoke them aloud. The data from GOES-19 came next. Although designed to study Earth's atmosphere, its coronagraph caught Atlas's reflection indirectly, through scattered solar photons. The readings showed spikes of ultraviolet radiation aligning with magnetic disturbances in the solar wind. Every time the Sun released a coronal mass ejection, Atlas responded with a flare of its own, not delayed, but immediate. How could a comet anticipate solar behavior? Perhaps, some theorized, it was reacting, absorbing energy bursts, discharging them in measured counter-emission, a survival mechanism, a system response. The line between biology and engineering blurred. In the sterile corridors of mission control, awe slowly turned into strategy. If this was a natural body, science must adapt. If it was technological, humanity must prepare. And so, for the first time in history, NASA, ESA, and JAXA began running defense-grade predictive modeling, not for impact, but for maneuver. What would Earth do if Atlas changed course? The simulations offered no comfort. Even a small deflection near the Sun could redirect its path across the plane of Earth's orbit months later. The probability was small, less than 0.001%, but enough for precaution. The Earth Defense Group extended monitoring beyond astronomy. Radar stations, communication networks, even military satellites were asked to watch for anomalous trajectories. Still, the data from the void persisted. The stereo A feed showed a steady, brightening, but not chaotic harmonic, as if rising through octaves of light. The amplitude of the blue emission oscillated, each crest higher than the last. Something was charging. An analyst at ESA compared the data to electrical resonance and quietly said, "It's storing energy." Another, less patient, muttered, "It's winding up." For all the fear and speculation, there was beauty too. The images reconstructed in false color looked like art, a sapphire thread coiled around gold fire, an alien calligraphy written against the brilliance of the Sunday. And then, without warning, the pulse stopped. For 3 days, no satellite recorded emission. The void became absolute. Many thought it was over, that Atlas had finally succumbed to the solar inferno. Others feared the opposite, that it had completed whatever process it began. On the 4th day, a single data packet arrived from Stereo B. The object had shifted trajectory by a fraction too small for the public to notice, but precise enough for every physicist to understand. The vector change was controlled, deliberate, calculated during the moment of invisibility. The maneuver mirrored the kind performed by our own spacecraft when using solar gravity for acceleration, a gravitational slingshot. And just like that, the whispers of plasma drives, of directed thrust, no longer sounded like science fiction. When the data was confirmed, an engineer in Darmstadt simply exhaled and said, "It's doing what we would do." The next transmission from Soho captured a faint resurgence of blue, emerging from the sun's glare. Atlas was alive, stronger, hotter. Its corona stretched wider than before, not a diffuse haze, but a deliberate arc, curved like the edge of a sail catching wind. A light sail. The realization settled like frost through every control room on Earth. Perhaps Atlas wasn't moving through sunlight. Perhaps it was sailing on it. And if so, then the void had eyes indeed, not human, not terrestrial, but aware, awake, and watching us from the other side of the Sunday. In December, the silence finally broke. The sun turned, and with it, the hidden side of the solar system came slowly back into view. Telescopes across Earth, still scarred from months of frustration, prepared for a reawakening. On the night of December 19th, 2025, the James Webb Space Telescope opened its golden eyes toward the coordinates where 3I Atlas should reappear. What it found made even the veterans of 1,000 discoveries hold their breath. Atlas had returned, but changed. The object emerged from the solar glare not as a dying ember, but as a deep azure flame. Its glow was no longer erratic. It was serene, steady, powerful, like a heartbeat found after cardiac death. The energy it radiated surpassed all prior measurements. Against the black of interplanetary space, its halo had grown, a ghostly plume stretching hundreds of thousands of kilometers, curling into filaments that seemed to shimmer in rhythm with the sun's magnetic field. When the first filtered images arrived at NASA's Goddard Center, a hush fell over the control room. One technician whispered, "It's brighter." The response came from another, trembling, "No, it's alive." For the first time, ground-based observatories confirmed what the satellites had only hinted. Atlas was emitting structured light. Spectroscopic analysis revealed a modulation pattern buried in the ultraviolet range, an oscillation that didn't match any known astrophysical process. It was too regular, too deliberate. The peaks occurred in intervals of exact ratios that corresponded, astonishingly, to the Fibonacci sequence. Nature loves patterns, but it rarely loves perfection. The implications were staggering. Had Atlas evolved, reacting to its solar encounter, or had it simply completed some form of energy cycle, preparing for the next phase of its mission, whatever that was? Meanwhile, the NASA Earth Defense Group entered what it termed Phase Blue. Officially, the mission's purpose was still planetary safety. Unofficially, it was something far older in human instinct. Watch the fire, make sure it does not move toward you. Teams at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory ran trajectory comparisons between the pre- and post-perihelion paths. The change was undeniable. The object's velocity vector had shifted slightly, almost elegantly, like a hand adjusting a compass needle. It was now moving closer to the ecliptic plane, the flat disk where all the planets orbit. In other words, closer to us. It was subtle enough to deny panic, yet clear enough to command attention. The statistical likelihood of such a shift happening naturally was near zero. The conclusion no one wanted to write became impossible to ignore. Atlas had altered its path. The decision was made within hours. Webb, Hubble, and every major optical array would remain locked on the target for as long as visibility allowed. The European Extremely Large Telescope in Chile joined the network. Even the Chinese Fast Radio Observatory, normally tasked with cosmic microwave background surveys, was redirected. Humanity's entire astronomical arsenal turned to face one blue enigma drifting out of sunlight. And the data that came back blurred the line between science and poetry. Atlas's surface albedo, the measure of its reflectivity, was now greater than 1. That meant it was reflecting more light than it received, an impossibility. Unless, somehow, it was amplifying light, converting energy into emission, a photonic multiplier, a mirror that glowed. The radio silence continued, yet the object's visual presence was deafening. On December 21st, a pattern emerged in the light frequency data, a series of spikes occurring in pairs. Analysts mapped the sequence into binary code, out of curiosity more than belief. What appeared was meaningless at first. Clusters of repeating intervals, no recognizable order. But when one data scientist reversed the sequence, the pattern suddenly took form: a wave. Not a message, a signature. The waveform resembled the spectral imprint of hydrogen, the most common element in the universe and the one that defines its beginnings. Hydrogen's line is the cosmic constant, the first letter of creation's alphabet. Whether coincidence or design, Atlas was echoing the sound of existence itself. Astronomers wept quietly, not from fear, but from reverence. To them, it felt like the universe had sent back an answer, not in words, but in resonance. Yet, amid the wonder, unease grew sharper. Atlas was now on a trajectory that would bring it to within 0.3 astronomical units of Earth by February. Not close enough for collision, but close enough for observation, close enough to see us, if it was capable of seeing. The UN Space Governance Committee convened in emergency session. Behind closed doors, diplomats debated scenarios that had no precedent. Could humanity intercept an interstellar object? Should we? What would interception even mean when the target might be technological and superior? Meanwhile, Avi Loeb, speaking to a restless world, delivered a statement that felt both comforting and terrifying. Whatever 3I Atlas is, it has already taught us more about humility than any discovery in centuries. Perhaps that is its purpose, to make us listen. His words rippled through the world like scripture. The human race, long deaf to silence, was finally straining to hear. And as the observatories fed images of the blue wanderer to every glowing screen on Earth, people began to speak of it, not as a comet nor an object, but as a presence, something vast and patient, gliding through the void with meaning we could not yet decipher. In art, it was painted as a god. In science, modeled as an anomaly. In the quiet, private hearts of those who stared up at the night sky, it was something else entirely, a question without language, moving closer with every passing night. By the end of December, the tension had spilled beyond observatories and laboratories. It had reached the halls of diplomacy. What began as a scientific mystery was now a matter of global policy. The reappearance of 3I Atlas, brighter, closer, and inexplicably controlled, had forced world leaders into uneasy dialogue. The US administration called an emergency session at the United Nations. The official topic: Interstellar Object 3I Atlas Planetary Coordination Measures. Behind closed doors, it was less about coordination and more about fear. Representatives from 56 nations gathered, each already a signatory of the Artemis Accords, an alliance originally meant for peaceful space exploration. But now, those same accords had become the foundation for something far more serious: collective defense. The media called it the Artemis Pact Revisited, though insiders preferred its less poetic codename, Operation Dawnwatch. At NASA headquarters in Washington, quiet corridors thrummed with activity. The Earth Defense Group, already activated months before, began liaising directly with military branches for the first time. Data on Atlas was routed not only through the Deep Space Network, but through defense channels and early warning satellites. It was a strange fusion, astronomers working alongside generals, physicists beside tacticians. The stated reason was planetary safety, but within the briefing papers, the subtext was unmistakable. Humanity was preparing for first contact, or at least for its shadow. Dr. Mei-Ling Zhao and her international colleagues were summoned to present the 9 anomalies before the Joint Task Council. They projected the data graphs of spectral readings, temperature flux, trajectory deviations. When they reached the point where Atlas's reflectivity exceeded 1, the room fell silent. One general finally broke it. "So what you're saying is, it's not a rock?" Zhao nodded softly. "It's something else." Another official leaned forward. "Could it be hostile?" She hesitated before answering. "It hasn't acted like anything alive or aggressive. If it's technological, it's either observing or ignoring us." Ignoring. The word echoed like a bruise in the chamber. The thought that something from another world could cross the gulf of light years and still deem humanity unworthy of notice was perhaps more terrifying than hostility. Outside the conference rooms, the world below stirred restlessly. Social media buzzed with theories, from alien emissaries to artificial probes, seeded by a long-dead civilization. Governments scrambled to control the narrative, but the story had already escaped gravity. The blue visitor became headline, myth, prophecy, and meme all at once. Yet in the shadows of policy and press, something monumental was taking shape. Within the Artemis coalition, a document was drafted, a quiet addendum to the original accords. It outlined shared protocols for potential extraterrestrial contact, resource defense, and coordinated orbital response. The draft name, the Celestial Contingency Framework. Its language was careful, technical, bureaucratic, but between the lines, the intent was clear. Humanity was writing its first treaty for the unknown. Simultaneously, NASA's internal teams accelerated the development of Project Sentinel, a proposed network of deep space probes designed to triangulate and analyze interstellar anomalies. It was to be launched in record time, funded under emergency authorization. If 3I Atlas was indeed maneuvering intentionally, Sentinel's job would be to learn why. In Europe, the European Space Agency began working with Japan's JAXA and India's ISRO to deploy small, rapid response observation drones capable of approaching Atlas when it passed near Earth's orbital plane. Officially, they were described as interplanetary research instruments. Unofficially, they were humanity's first scouts, eyes sent toward the unknown, mirroring the object's own silent observation. As preparations unfolded, the tone of the scientific community began to shift. Where once there had been dread, there was now a strange solemnity. The impossible had happened, and so all things had become possible. At the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, Avi Loeb addressed a global symposium streamed live to millions. In 1969, humanity looked up and walked on another world. In 2025, another world looked back. We can no longer think of the sky as silent. He spoke of humility, not fear, of learning to see ourselves as one species standing beneath a single cosmic question. His words reverberated far beyond science. Politicians quoted them. Religious leaders debated them. Ordinary citizens wrote them into prayers. Meanwhile, NASA's Earth Defense Group continued to meet in dim-lit rooms, staring at live telemetry projected on glowing screens. Every data stream showed the same truth. Atlas's trajectory was precise, deliberate, unwavering. Its closest approach was predicted for February 7th. Not dangerously near, but near enough to see detail, to measure, form, to look, finally, upon the face of the mystery. Somewhere between cooperation and caution, between reverence and readiness, humanity took its quiet stand. Satellites were repositioned, telescopes recalibrated, budgets reallocated. One phrase appeared again and again across briefings and reports: be ready to observe, not to act. It was perhaps the most fragile order ever given, one that demanded courage in stillness, restraint in the face of wonder. For all our centuries of conflict, greed, and curiosity, humanity had never faced the possibility of another intelligence arriving unannounced. And as the light of 3I Atlas shimmered faintly against the dark, it seemed the universe had sent not an enemy nor an ally, but a mirror. The nations had signed accords, activated defenses, built instruments, but none of it could prepare the soul for the truth that hovered quietly in every mind. What if this was not the first time something had passed through? What if this was only the first time we noticed? For centuries, the human imagination had conjured countless versions of alien visitation, glowing saucers, silent signals, flashes of intent across the dark. Yet none had anticipated this, an object too cold, too distant, too disciplined to reveal emotion, a riddle of physics masquerading as a machine. And so, with the blue fire of 3I Atlas blazing across the void, the theories multiplied. The first to gain traction was the propulsion hypothesis that Atlas was an autonomous vessel, powered by radiation pressure. It would make sense of its impossible temperature, its directional emission, its subtle course correction near the Sunday. Scientists began comparing its trajectory to the equations governing solar sails, those thin, reflective sheets of engineered material capable of riding sunlight as a ship rides wind. The match was uncanny. But then came the problem: size. A solar sail requires vast surface area to catch light effectively. Yet, Atlas was small, too small to produce its acceleration naturally. Unless, of course, it wasn't reflecting light but amplifying it. This led to a second hypothesis: photonic resonance. The idea that Atlas might contain a lattice of nanoscale structures designed to trap and redirect photons, a light engine powered by starlight itself. It would explain the blueness, the symmetry, the perfect temperature beyond expectation. The idea seemed almost mystical: a ship that drank sunlight and turned it into motion, an artifact of civilization so advanced it used stars as oceans. Yet the third theory was stranger still: quantum propulsion, a speculative concept drawn from the mathematics of field manipulation. If Atlas could interact with vacuum energy, the latent sea of particles fluctuating in and out of existence, it might draw infinite motion from nothing. Such technology existed only in equations and thought experiments. But now, an object had appeared that behaved as though those equations were alive. In the quiet of the Harvard Astrophysics Library, Loeb and Zhao discussed it late one night. "Maybe it isn't coming from another civilization," Zhao said softly. "Maybe it's coming from time." The notion hung between them, not a joke, not even a theory, but a whisper of wonder. What if Atlas wasn't alien, but human, a relic of a distant future, returning to the past through mechanisms beyond comprehension? What if its perfect silence was a mercy, not a mystery? Still others clung to the observer hypothesis that Atlas was a probe designed only to watch, to gather, to measure. It might be older than Earth itself, drifting from star to star, awakening briefly when it detected the telltale signatures of life: radio waves, pollution, nuclear light. It would approach, observe, and move on. The haunting implication was that we were not special, merely another species under observation. In the shadow of such cosmic possibility, philosophy reawakened. Theologians quoted scripture in the language of astrophysics. Artists painted the blue comet as a watchful eye, half mechanical, half divine. Newspapers ran headlines that read like prayers: "The universe is listening." But even among the theorists, skepticism endured. A faction of scientists, led by the European Astrophysical Council, argued for a simpler truth. Atlas was a natural interstellar fragment, a product of volatile reactions yet unknown. They warned against surrendering reason to imagination. "The universe is stranger than we can dream," one paper declared, "but not necessarily alive." Still, the evidence continued to erode doubt. New data from the James Webb Space Telescope revealed thin lines across Atlas's spectrum interference patterns that should not exist in natural emission. Some called it coincidence, others interference from the sun's magnetic field. But a small group saw structure harmonics, like frequencies woven into light. Harmonics mean tuning, and tuning implies design. By January 2026, the debate reached fever pitch. Scientific journals refused to publish new papers until NASA released its hidden datasets. Petitions demanded transparency, but NASA remained silent, its public statements reduced to a single phrase: ongoing analysis. Meanwhile, the world began to behave as though the verdict were already known. CERN's research division announced a collaboration with the SETI Institute to re-examine past radio archives for similar anomalies. SpaceX offered to fast-track launches of observational probes under international funding. China's Tiangong station began scanning the infrared spectrum in the direction of Atlas, citing unprecedented research opportunity. And yet, amid the flurry of science and politics, a subtler transformation occurred within humanity itself. People began to look up again, to talk about wonder without irony. to argue not about faith versus reason, but about how the two might finally meet. Because whether 3I Atlas was a machine, a message, or a mistake, it had reignited the oldest fire in human thought, the yearning to know if we were ever truly alone. In those final weeks before its closest approach, every theory, every paper, every whispered prayer converged into a single feeling that no science could quantify: the feeling that the universe had opened its eyes, and that, for the first time in history, Earth was part of its gaze. The blue light in the sky was no longer a visitor. It was a mirror. Fear, wonder, hope, these are the three oldest languages of the human soul, and all three spoke at once, as 3I Atlas drew closer to Earth. For scientists, it was an event of pure data, numbers, trajectories, and radiance. But for everyone else, it was an awakening, a shiver that passed from the observatories to the living rooms, from government chambers to quiet night skies. People began to gather outside, night after night, gazing upward, waiting to glimpse the faint blue shimmer that now rose like a new star above the horizon. But with the light came unease. Beneath the surface of scientific fascination lay something raw, something ancient, the human fear of the other. Every civilization in history has told stories about what lies beyond its horizon. Myths of gods descending from the heavens, angels, demons, chariots of fire. The unknown has always reflected us back to ourselves, magnified, distorted, glorified, or damned. 3I Atlas was no different. To the rational, it was a comet behaving strangely. To the fearful, it was the herald of judgment. To the dreamers, it was a sign that we were not alone. Yet the most haunting reaction came from those who felt neither terror nor awe, but insignificance. A philosopher from Geneva wrote, "For the first time, we are not the observers of the cosmos, but the observed." That line spread faster than any data release, quoted across social media and speeches, carved into murals, and echoed in countless late-night broadcasts. The fear wasn't that 3I Atlas might attack, or even communicate. The fear was that it might understand, that, somewhere inside its silent shell, lay intelligence cold enough to cross light years and yet find nothing worth speaking to. NASA, still maintaining composure, continued its research. Yet even within the agency, cracks appeared. Some scientists confessed that their objectivity had fractured. How does one remain dispassionate in the presence of something that might embody the next step of consciousness itself? Avi Loeb called it the quiet crisis of significance. In a televised address, he said, "If this object was made by another mind, then we must face a new kind of humility, not the humility of smallness, but of irrelevance." He paused. "For centuries, we believed the universe was vast but empty. What if it is vast because it is full?" His words struck a chord. Religion, long pushed to the margins of scientific discourse, re-entered the conversation. The Vatican released a statement reminding the faithful that creation is greater than comprehension. Meanwhile, physicists debated whether intelligence was an emergent property of matter or an inevitability of mathematics, a principle woven into the geometry of space-time itself. As the public gazed upward, their reactions diverged in strange symmetry. One half of humanity turned inward, toward prayer and philosophy. The other turned outward, toward technology, as though to prove its own worth. Innovation accelerated. New AI systems were trained to parse Atlas's light variations, searching for encoded logic. The irony was breathtaking: machines built by humans trying to read the light of a machine not built by humans. And all the while, the fear remained subtle but pervasive. It was not the cinematic terror of invasion, but something quieter, the existential vertigo that comes when a mirror is placed too close to the soul. Psychologists began documenting a new condition: contact anxiety. People who couldn't sleep, who reported feeling watched by the stars. Some described recurring dreams of an immense blue eye hovering over the world, not judging, merely observing. In art, 3i. Atlas became a symbol of both creation and extinction. A filmmaker compared it to the moment a child realizes their parent is not omnipotent, the loss of cosmic innocence. Poets wrote verses where the blue light was a messenger of both mercy and mourning. And through it all, one question threaded every discipline, every philosophy, every prayer. If Atlas is alive, why is it silent? Silence became its own form of communication. Scientists began to suspect that perhaps the silence was deliberate, a form of respect or restraint, a gesture of non-interference, as if to say, "We have come this far. Now it is your turn." The world split between those who saw this as benevolence and those who saw it as apathy. Was Atlas watching because it cared, or because it didn't need to? For all our progress, humanity remained a young species, prone to fear the unknown and even more to fear what it revealed about us. The human response to 3i Atlas was a map of our own psychology. Awe turned to dread, curiosity turned to conspiracy, reverence turned to rage. We projected our deepest selves onto that distant, radiant enigma. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the true test of contact was not whether we were capable of understanding others, but whether we were capable of understanding ourselves. One night, as Atlas's light shimmered faintly against the winter sky, a child asked her mother what it was. The mother paused, unable to find words that fit both science and wonder. Finally, she said, "Maybe it's the universe's way of asking if we're ready." And across the earth, in cities, deserts, mountains, oceans, millions looked up, not with fear anymore, but with quiet expectation. For if the unknown was watching, then so were we, two forms of awareness, suspended across the same ocean of night, divided only by silence. By the dawn of February, Earth waited. Every telescope was awake, every scientist sleepless, every whisper on the planet tuned to the same silent frequency. The object 3i Atlas was approaching its closest pass to our world, gliding through the solar plane like a sapphire wound in light. For weeks, predictions had filled the air. Would it accelerate, dim, change course? Would it reveal a surface, a structure, something unmistakably artificial? Or would it pass as quietly as it came, leaving only questions behind? The night before closest approach, the James Webb Space Telescope transmitted images that stunned even those who had prepared for miracles. Atlas was no longer a single, solid mass. It was somehow fracturing, but not chaotically. The fragments moved in formation, spacing themselves at equidistant intervals. The geometry was almost too perfect. Astronomers described it as a constellation formation. Engineers called it impossible. The smaller bodies, each glowing faintly blue, drifted outward in a pattern reminiscent of a spiral galaxy seen from above. They weren't debris, they were arranged. And as the pattern expanded, a faint electromagnetic resonance began to wash through the radio spectrum, a whisper of signal, pulsing in the same Fibonacci rhythm first detected weeks before. NASA's Deep Space Network confirmed it. The pulses were coming not from one source, but many. Each fragment was broadcasting in unison, synchronized across millions of kilometers. The transmission wasn't speech, it was structure. When the data was mapped in 3 dimensions, the pattern formed a mathematical lattice, ratios, primes, and irrational numbers intertwined. The code was pure geometry, the language of physics itself. Dr. Zhao stared at the evolving pattern and said, "They're writing in the fabric of mathematics." For a moment, no one spoke. Humanity had expected either silence or words, but not this, a communication that transcended all translation. Not a greeting, but a demonstration. This is how we think. Governments worldwide went on alert, not for threat, but for comprehension. The UN declared a 72-hour quiet window, a symbolic gesture asking nations to cease weapons tests, rocket launches, and electromagnetic interference. The world complied. For 3 days, Earth's noise dimmed and the stars reclaimed their rightful sound. The data kept streaming in. The Webb telescope's infrared sensors detected faint thermal variations across the Atlas fragments. Each fragment cooled at precisely the same rate, as if operating on a shared internal system, a choreography of energy. And then, almost tenderly, they began to dim. The fragments folded inward, aligning back into a single, cohesive shape. The brightness stabilized, the pulse slowed, and within hours, Atlas was whole again, restored, complete, serene. The broadcast ceased. The object continued its course past the orbit of Venus, moving outward, away from Earth. It had come, spoken in the purest possible language order, and departed. Some called it a message, others a test, but for many it felt like witnessing the slow blink of an intelligence so vast it had no need for drama, only demonstration. Avi Loeb released one final statement to the press. Maybe we were not the recipients of a message. Maybe we were part of an experiment to see if we could recognize one. Around the world, reactions split like light through a prism. Skeptics declared coincidence. Spiritual leaders saw revelation. Philosophers argued that meaning is not given, it is found. Yet all agreed on one thing: humanity had changed. In classrooms and living rooms, in deserts and cities, people looked up not with fear, but with the quiet understanding that something in the universe had noticed us and left us to interpret its silence. As 3I Atlas receded into the night of the outer system, it left behind not destruction, not salvation, but reflection. We were still here, still wondering, still fragile, luminous minds trying to make sense of the vast. The Webb telescope tracked it until the glow vanished beyond the limits of vision. It was last recorded near the orbit of Mars, still pulsing faintly in infrared, a heartbeat fading into the infinite. Afterward, the world exhaled. NASA closed the emergency briefings. The Earth Defense Group went dormant. Life resumed, but not unchanged. Something had crossed through our solar system, a quiet traveler carrying neither weapon nor word, but something far stranger, a mirror. And in that mirror, for the first time, humanity saw itself clearly, small, brilliant, trembling, and aware. The countdown clocks stopped. The telescopes stood down. But in every observatory, every laboratory, every watching soul, the same realization remained. The universe had never been silent. We had simply never learned to listen. In the days after 3I Atlas receded into the black, a strange quiet settled over Earth. No more emergency briefings, no more coded alerts. The telescopes no longer screamed for attention. They simply hummed in their silent orbits, collecting the cold light of ordinary stars. The blue beacon had gone, leaving only its reflection in our minds. And yet, the silence it left behind was not empty. It was full of meaning, of awe, of an ancient awareness that could not be measured in data or degrees. Humanity had looked into the dark and seen something looking back. Reports still trickled through. The Webb telescope captured Atlas's final spectral echo, a faint ripple in ultraviolet light that faded steadily until it merged with cosmic background radiation. Some scientists called it a decay signature, others a message of closure. To poets, it was a farewell wave from a traveler that had never belonged to us. In the aftermath, theories collapsed under their own beauty. There was no proof, no revelation, only the humbling certainty that we had witnessed a moment of cosmic intention, however brief. The data would be analyzed for decades, debated for centuries, and yet no conclusion could match the emotional gravity of that single truth. We are not alone in mystery. The Earth Defense Group disbanded quietly. Its work, for now, was done. In the archives of NASA, the Atlas dossier was sealed with a single line on its cover: origin undetermined. But outside those walls, the consequences rippled. Humanity began to change not through conquest, but through contemplation. School children memorized constellations again. Cities dimmed their lights for stargazing festivals. Telescopes sold out worldwide. The night sky had ceased to be a ceiling. It had become a frontier once more. Scientists, too, found themselves altered. Equations were written differently now, not as walls but as windows. The border between empirical and philosophical thinned, and a new generation of researchers spoke about ethics and wonder with the same precision as thermodynamics. To study the cosmos was no longer to seek dominance, it was to learn humility. And in that humility, a quiet unity bloomed. For once, nations shared data without agenda. The maps of the sky were redrawn not by borders, but by curiosity. Humanity, so often divided by creed and country, stood together in a shared awareness that our planet was but a pale reflection in an endless sea, and that perhaps, somewhere out there, other reflections shone back. For months, radio astronomers continued to listen. No signals came, but every so often, static would hum in a pattern of gentle intervals, almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. They called it the Atlas Pulse. Most dismissed it as interference. Others smiled and said, "He's still out there." The memory of blue light remained a color too vivid for the mind to forget. It appeared in art, in architecture, in dreams. It was seen in ocean waves and twilight skies, in the glow of every screen that tried to imitate the heavens. It became, quietly, a symbol of awareness. And in time, humanity did what it always does. When faced with the infinite, it began again. Telescopes were built larger, deeper. Probes were sent farther. Our questions, once tinged with arrogance, were now whispered with reverence. Each mission was no longer just exploration, but an offering small vessels of our curiosity, cast into the current of eternity. If Atlas had been a message, it had not spoken in language, it had spoken in presence, in patience, in the gentle reminder that discovery is not conquest, but communion. On a clear night, when the solar winds calm and the Earth drifts in quiet rotation, one can look up and imagine the blue traveler somewhere beyond sight, sailing between stars, carrying our reflection with it. It is not a threat. It is not salvation. It is simply the echo of what we might become, a civilization that learns to move not in fear, but in wonder. And perhaps, when we have earned the silence, when our machines hum as gently as the stars themselves, the universe will speak again. Until then, the night remains vast, the stars eternal, and the question infinite. For now, that is enough. The story of 3i Atlas fades now, softly, into the folds of time. Its light no longer burns through our telescopes, yet it burns still quietly in us. We learned something that no discovery can undo, that mystery itself is sacred. Perhaps the object was only a comet, a coincidence of nature's poetry. Perhaps it was a messenger or an artifact from minds beyond imagining. But whatever it was, it held up a mirror to our species and asked the gentlest of questions: will you keep looking? We will. The skies above Earth shimmer tonight with familiar constellations, yet none of them feel the same. Somewhere behind them drifts a small blue ember, a relic of curiosity and courage. And in its wake, humanity stands awake again, uncertain, imperfect, wondrously aware. We will search for it. We will search for meaning. We will search, as we always have, for ourselves. The universe waits not impatiently, not cruelly. but as a teacher waits for the pupil to ask the right question. When we do, perhaps the stars will answer. Until then, the silence is not emptiness, it is promise. Sweet dreams.